All right. So yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. Um, sorry that we have to do it online like this, not in person. I see some people asking about foraging events that we had planned later this year, and as of right now, we're not planning on having them in person. If we do, or if we did, it would end up being very small groups anyway, just in the spirit of proper social distancing. So we'll make do for now with lots of pretty pictures and lots of descriptions, but hopefully it won't be too far in the future that we can have a lot of people back out onto the land and seeing these things in person. So yeah, as Alex said, we've had a lot of interest in mushrooms and fungi in general. It's a hot topic right now, and for very good reason. There's a lot of amazing things that we continue to learn about them, especially through a lot of research that's being done relating to using them as medicine, using them in restoration practices. But the oldest connection that we have to them, probably the nearest and dearest for people all over the world, is that we can eat them, is that they're delicious. Many of them are very healthy for us, very high in a lot of different nutrients. A lot of them, as I'll get into, are in general, they're a very good source of antioxidants. And there are quite a lot of them. There's quite a variety. They can take on many different flavors, many different styles. You can cook them all sorts of ways. So again, this class, I've got probably about a dozen species that we're going to focus on, mostly some choice edibles that we can find in our area. Again, I'm mostly looking at the East Coast U.S. forest system, so temperate forests, and again, specifically this time of year. Some of these might start a little earlier in the year. We'll say, mid to late summer. Some of them might start a little later, definitely getting into fall, further into October. But in general, we're looking at August through October. Some of them even beyond that. These are mushrooms that are showing up this time of year. So get a little idea under your belt, and hopefully you'll be able to go out and be fortunate enough to find these exact species. It's a fun experience foraging, hunting for mushrooms. If you haven't done it before, I highly recommend it. Even if you're not super psyched about the taste of mushrooms, some people love it, some people don't. It can still be a very rewarding experience. I know some incredible foragers who have an amazing encyclopedic knowledge of different species of fungi and mushrooms that don't particularly like eating them at all, and they just love the hobby of going out and finding them and identifying them. So there's something for everybody in it. I am going to mostly use pictures. Most of these I do not have the rights to. I just pulled them off the internet as choice representations for looking at different ID features of the species. So I'm going to try and share my screen and we can get going. As Alex said, if anybody has questions at any point, just put them in the chat and we'll address them as we go through the class. And as I'm making this work, I will give the ever important stipulation that anytime that you are looking for wild mushrooms, particularly to eat them for food or medicine, you need to be 100% sure that you know what you are eating. As we'll discuss with some specific examples, there are a lot of cases of lookalikes, and sometimes those lookalikes are poisonous. Sometimes they are toxic just enough to make you sick. Sometimes they're toxic enough to kill you pretty quickly. So it is always important that you know exactly what you're putting into your body. Don't just rely off of your memory for an identification. Don't just rely off of a single ID book that you're carrying with you. Check it with multiple books. Check it with websites. If you really want to get into it, there's all kinds of local groups at the local and the state level for enthusiasts. As some people are already involved with the Facebook group, get involved with these local groups. Share pictures. Get somebody else to back up this ID for you. Just make sure that we're not poisoning ourselves. All right, if I do this, does everybody see a picture of a mushroom? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, it worked then. Good. So first off the bat here, we have a most of these are going to be very popular, if not by visual, then by name. This is a popular one called hen of the woods. The Latin name, the scientific name is Grifola frondosa. Some people might also
Taylor,
come.
can you open the picture? Right now we just see the numbers, like all the photos.
Oh, okay. Let me try. Well, I opened it. I guess it only wanted to open on my screen. What if I do this?
Yes.
Okay, one big picture. This is hen of the woods, Grifola frondosa. A lot of people might also commonly know it as the maitake mushroom or the sheep's head mushroom. It always grows in this large bunch. It's like a bunch of small, separate fans almost growing out of each other. They bunch up onto each other and they form these mounds. These mounds can be, 6 inches across, a small little bundle, or as they grow, they can get, bigger than the span of my hand on average. For most of these, especially if you're looking online for reference material, you are going to find pictures of, there's always somebody that's found an astoundingly large one. But I'll tend to give you average sizes just of what I have found in the wild around here. So these tend to be, they can make large enough clusters that I hold them in both hands, like a small melon, shall we say. They have a very solid, strong mushroom flavor, pretty distinct. Some people kind of compare it to the chicken of the woods and like tastes like chicken kind of thing, but that's a different species and we'll get to that too. You'll notice this very earthy coloration, especially on the caps here. The tops of the caps are darker brown. They can get even these blacker kind of charred coloration to them. It blends in phenomenally, especially getting later into the fall when all of the leaves are falling. There's a bunch of debris on the ground. If you're not really looking at this thing, it's going to be, you can very easily walk right by it. And so where should we be looking for it? As with most of these mushrooms that we're going to be talking about, again, we're looking in the woods. While there are plenty of species of mushrooms that we can find out in fields and much more open landscapes, forests are the prime place to find mushrooms and fungi of all kinds. Fungi and bacteria are the primary organisms that do all the decomposition on our planet, breaking down all of the organic material of dead things to convert it back into nutrients and process it into soil. And fungi specifically have adapted and evolved to be able to handle breaking down the hard, complex structure of wood, particularly like lignin. Bacteria are not very good at breaking it down, and a lot of them can't do it at all. So in most cases, fungi are the only organisms that have really specialized to be able to break down hard lignin, the woody material of perennial plants. So we find fungi dominating the soils of forests. And so 9 times out of 10, when we're looking for these different species, we're looking for them in association with trees. Some of them will be growing on living trees specifically, some of them only on dead trees, some of them can handle both. I have seen hen of the woods growing around both. You'll usually find it at the base of trees, as you can see here. Let me get another. Here's another one. This one looks a little nicer, a little more pristine. But again, we have these overlapping heads forming this ball. This is also forming at the base of a hardwood. Most often, you are going to see these with oaks. The hen of the woods is most commonly associated with oak trees of all kinds. In our area specifically, the most common oak that we get is the white oak. So more often than not, I see it around the white oak. But I have seen it growing out of birch trees. I have seen it growing out of cherry trees. I have talked to people that have seen it growing on beech trees and even walnuts. We have a lot of black walnuts around here. And supposedly they can handle that wood as well. So quite a diversity of hardwood trees that we have here on the East Coast. You will definitely tend to find them on older trees. Not necessarily older as in dying on their way out, but just much more mature trees. Like even large trees that are, 20 to 30 years old, that's still pretty young for a tree, and I don't tend to see that. More often than not, I see these kind of the woods clusters forming around trees that are 100+ years old. So kind of have to go a little deeper into the woods to look for this choice one. Again, this example is a little different than the previous one, but we still have the idea that the tops have these dark browns and tan colors, even forming to kind of like a blackish at some points. But because the underbelly is very white, you can see this distinctive line, this ridge along the edge of the cap, where basically where the underside meets the darker upper side, and it can make it look like these distinct lines outlining each of the separate caps. If we look closely underneath, we can see where the spores form. Here's one more example. This one I put in just to show the variety of color. We have a much darker coloration here, a much lighter one. Still, we see some splotchiness. We see this darker brown coloration, and it will certainly be much darker on the top of the cap than on the bottom. But just to give you an appreciation of the variety. Any of these pictures are purely representative, both in shape and color. Mushrooms can take on all kinds of different looks, especially depending on the particulars of the place where they're growing. But I wanted to show you this. So if we look at the underside of the cap, this is where the spores are forming. This is the ultimate purpose that the fungus has for the mushroom. The mushroom is the reproductive structure. It's like fruit, like the apple. It's really only meant to carry the seed. The mushroom is really just meant to cast spores out into the environment, drop that next generation out. And this underside of the cap is a really good ID feature for multiple reasons. The color of it can be very distinguishing, and the structure that the spores come out of is also a very distinguishing feature. In this case, it's kind of tricky to see with this picture, but especially over here from this right angle, we can see that most of the time there are very distinct, it's just a pattern of holes that you'll see on the underside of the hen of the woods. And these holes, we call them pores. And that is because this is a polypore mushroom, a large group of different species of fungi, but basically just distinguished by the fact that the reproductive structure, the mushrooms that they produce, have this network of pores on the underside. And the spores are produced, deeper in the tunnel, the microscopic tunnel of these pores, and they get puffed out when the time is right. This is compared to gills, which is probably the most common type of mushroom that people think of, the long slits of flesh on the underside that release spores. We'll see some of that in later examples. But the hen of the woods is a polypore. Yep.
So Jeff asks that he says he missed several blooms of this particular mushroom on his property that are now black and too old. How long do they bloom for?
These in particular, probably no more than a week in the right conditions. Mushrooms in general are pretty ephemeral. The vast, even more so than our bodies, the majority of a fungus's body is water. And it takes a lot of water to make these very soft, fleshy things that are mushrooms. This is the most common reason why we tend to see a lot of fresh mushrooms coming out after a heavy rain. It's basically because even if the fungal organism is primed and ready to produce fruit, to grow mushrooms, if there isn't enough moisture in the ground that it can siphon to put into this new soft tissue, it'll wait. It won't produce anything. It'll wait, and then finally we'll get a big rainstorm. The ground will be saturated enough that the fungus has enough water, and then usually overnight or within a day or two, we see all of these mushrooms sprouting. So that's why right after rain is a good time to go. Unfortunately, because the mushrooms tend to be very soft and chock full of water, they don't last that long. They're usually lasting just long enough to grow to maturity, drop a countless number of spores, and then dissolve basically. And usually, even before they start dissolving, you'll find evidence of other critters getting to them. If you're not fast enough, lots of times, even after you harvest, you can have all kinds of little bite holes in there, or you definitely always want to wash mushrooms that you bring in if for no other reason to get rid of any potential bugs that are in there. So between it not lasting that long anyway, before it served its purpose and it breaks down, and other critters potentially getting into it, I'd probably say no more than a week. If you have some that persisted long enough to where they were breaking down and getting that real black color, I bet if you tore them open a bit, you'd also find a lot of insects or other organisms taking advantage of them even still. But yeah, unfortunately, with most of these things, I'd say it's usually not more than a week after it starts to grow that it's probably going to start being on its way out. It's definitely again, they're very ephemeral. There's usually a short window to get them in their prime. There are lots of species that they can be a little past prime and you can still collect them, you can still harvest them, and they'll still be great, especially if your intention is not to eat them fresh, but to dry them out. And then whether to dry them out and store them for food purposes or for medicine. That's probably the most common way that people will preserve them for medicine, to just completely dry them out and then usually grind them into a powder or chop them into very smaller bits for consumption later on. Maitake, so polypores in general tend to be a little harder, especially as they age. That's another thing that you'll find with a lot of mushroom species is as they get past their prime, some of them, as they get past the prime, they'll just start breaking down immediately. They'll just be like dissolving basically, or like a mold will really take them over. Others, the actual mushroom will last a lot longer, but the older it gets, the tougher and almost like woodier, corkier that the flesh becomes, and it to the point where it's unpalatable. And I tend to find with polypores, they get a lot harder in general. They get that corkier texture as they age, and that's probably what, as in the case you're describing, is allowing them to persist so long to the point where they're just these shriveled little black things. It's because whatever's left has built up enough really thick tissue that it's going to persist for quite a lot longer. I have seen these. I have seen hen of the woods flush multiple times in the same location, which can be nice. So, you know, especially if you happen to find a choice place that you can harvest and you find some and they're past their prime, don't immediately be discouraged and just, oh, well, we'll try again next year. Keep going back to that same location, keep observing it, especially if we have a wet enough period for a long enough time. If the fungus has the nutrients and the water that is required, then it's just going to keep on producing more and more fruit to make more spores. And so in ideal conditions, you know, again, you could find a couple like, oh, these aren't really good, they're not worth harvesting. But maybe if you come back in a couple of days, you're going to find some brand new tiny ones that just started to crop up. Hen of the woods in general, I was saying that polypores tend to be thicker in texture, especially as they age. Not as much so with hen of the woods. It definitely seems to have a softer, fleshier texture than a lot of other polypores, which is nice. It's definitely a big reason why it's a choice edible for a lot of people. There are plenty of there's a long history of this mushroom also being used for medicinal purposes. At this point, I've read some really good research that speaks to the immune benefits of taking hen of the woods, specifically that it is really good for stimulating your immune system. So it can be really good to take. Again, normally if I'm taking mushrooms medicinally, I'll dry them out. And then whether you take them powdered or you could put them in a capsule or something, it can be good to take it as an immune stimulant when you're getting sick. And it can help to basically kick your immune system into gear and respond to the potential illness faster and hopefully help you resolve it faster. Again, that's the best research that I've seen for this. There is fortunately more and more research coming out on the medicinal benefits of different species of mushrooms every single year. It's being taken much more seriously than it has in past decades. But there's still plenty out there that's unfounded. There's lots of claims of the benefits of these. And so it's well worth doing a bit of reading, especially if you want to actively, consistently hunt for, forage for the same species and take it consistently as a medicine. Definitely do your reading. Most of the time, you know, if anything, like, it can't hurt. It's definitely gonna help in some way for you to consume these nutrients. But there are definitely some species that there's a lot more research out there, and there is definitive work showing that you get very specific immune benefits from consuming different mushrooms, hen of the woods included. So let's move on. Kind of similar to hen in the woods is chicken of the woods. You can immediately see the biggest distinction between the two species is the color. We get this radiant orange and yellows with the chicken of the woods. This is Latiporus sulphureus. So very differently related to hen of the woods. It's not even like they're in the same genus together. But we can see a very similar form. We have these separate caps that are fan-like and radiating out one over top of the other, so you can get these big bunches. Chicken of the woods, in my experience, it is always growing off of, I've really only ever seen it on dead wood, specifically deciduous wood. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, it's a brown rot fungus. So you're not going to find this growing on living trees. Perhaps trees that are on their way out that are mostly dead, or there's a large portion of the tree that's dead, even though another part of it's still alive. As long as it's dead tissue, the chicken of the woods is going to be breaking it down. Again, I tend to see it on deciduous trees. The best example I have is for the past 3 years at Foxhaven, we have quite a few years ago, a very massive willow tree fell down, and we left most of the trunk where it fell. And that's been really great because for the past 3 years, we've gotten a massive flush of chicken of the woods on that same dead trunk. Always more than enough for everybody working here to take some and enjoy it. And this is the perfect time. I haven't seen it yet, but fingers crossed that we'll still get some of it this year, because again, like, getting into September and October is exactly when I expect to see this. Like the hen of the woods, it is also a polypore, which means that when we look at the underside, or we look at the spore-producing organs, we're going to see a series of pores or holes as opposed to gills. So it's going to be like a flat surface with all of these holes in it, pores. It has a really good flavor, as the name suggests. A lot of people say that it is reminiscent of chicken. It definitely, I don't know if I would describe it as chicken, but it definitely has a meatiness to it. It doesn't have as strong and earthy of a traditional mushroom taste as a lot of other mushrooms will find. This meatiness lends it really well to being a meat substitute in all kinds of dishes. And as with quite a lot of mushrooms, it takes to sauces really well. So it's a really good one. Again, whether you just enjoy it as is or as a meat substitute, once you have seasoned it, allowed it to saturate in a sauce before you cook it up, for the most part, it's taken on the flavor of whatever you're mixing it in.
We have a couple of questions.
Shoot.
So Emily asks, do you have any favorite research resources?
I definitely do. The first one that comes to mind is the website Mushroom Expert. That is a gentleman who lives in our area, East Coast US over here. Michael Quo. Mr. Quo. His last name's definitely Quo. I believe it's Michael. We'll have his website listed. But he is a beautiful example of somebody that is in. He's not trained as an expert in any way. He's just a hobbyist that got into it and kept getting into it and kept getting into it. He got to the point of getting into microscope and laboratory equipment to look at the microscopic features that are sometimes essential for IDing different species of mushrooms and fungi. And he's created this encyclopedia online on mushroomexpert.com that is a fantastic, very up-to-date source of mushrooms throughout the US, but specifically here on the East Coast. Very high quality pictures of them, very high quality descriptions of them. Yeah, I'll recommend him. Again, that's off the top of my head. There are plenty of other sources, which we'll include we have a handout that'll go out to all of you after the class as well. So you'll definitely have plenty of sources there. Also off the top of my head, I will go ahead and recommend, and this is a good one for anybody in the US, the book Mushrooms Demystified by Mr. David Aurora. This is a standard within the mushroom and foraging world. It is a tome of information. It is an excellent reference guide. It is a guide that gives you scientific keys, which if you're not familiar, they're very easy to figure out. They're almost like a choose your own adventure, but it's basically a very formalized system of ID where you start at, it's a series of questions. So you start at question 1 and it'll ask you, it'll usually start very simple, like, does the fungus have gills or does it have pores on the underside? And if you say gills, go to question 2. If you say pores, go to question 3. And then it'll ask you a slightly more specific question of, does the mushroom, is it this color or is it that color? And basically it'll funnel you through these questions, getting much, much more specific as it goes. And hopefully at the other end, after you've answered so many questions, it'll lead you to just, you're probably looking at species A or species B. It can have a lot of jargon in it. Basically, just the more you get into mushroom ID, the more specific anatomy that you find that is unique to fungi and mushrooms. And so scientists and researchers had to come up with brand new names of, well, what do you call that little frill that occurs on that particular part of the stem? And there's a funky name for that. So sometimes you can be looking through a book of scientific keys and it can seem very daunting with all of this jargon. But, you know, especially in this day and age with the internet, it's all pretty easy to look up and you can do just fine. And it's an excellent reference guide. It'll also be on our list.
Awesome. Does chicken in the woods ever grow on pine? Is it possible but rare or impossible not going to happen at all?
I have never seen it grow on conifers. So evergreen trees like pines, firs, spruces. I have only ever seen it specifically on not just hardwood of deciduous trees, but I'm sorry, not. I've only ever seen it on deciduous hardwoods. So I've seen it on oaks and I've seen it on willows more predominantly than anything else. There's plenty of resources out there where, especially depending on where you are and depending on the hardwood deciduous trees that happen to be in your area, you might more prevalently see it on some other species. But in our immediate area, that's what I tend to see. Oaks more than anything. There's quite a lot of species of fungi that will grow in association with a lot of different oak species. They're one of the most common types of hardwood trees that we have on our forests here on the East Coast in general. And there's a lot of variety. So there's a lot of options for fungi that can break them down. So definitely, if you're just looking for mushrooms in general, check out the oaks because you're bound to find something. I will not say that means it's impossible for chicken of the woods to be on conifers. I've just never seen it myself, and I don't know if I've ever had anybody describe that or recommend certain conifer species to look at to find it. So maybe, I'm gonna say not in my experience, but maybe.
How do you tell a dead deciduous tree from a dead conifer?
Good question. The Well, first of all, this is the case with all trees. If they're dead, the more recently they have died, the easier they will be to ID. You know, with time and with the degradation, with things like fungi breaking them down, um, you know, when they first die, they're still pretty. They look pretty much exactly like what they did when they're alive, and then eventually, as the limbs break off, that makes it a little bit harder. If the bark starts to fall and peel off, that can make it a lot harder. Um, once they're really far gone, I'll say your best bet is, first of all, look at what's growing around you. If you're looking at something and you think, I can't tell if this is deciduous or maybe it's like a pine, maybe it's a white pine, presuming you're in a forest, look at the trees around you. And if there are no other white pines anywhere in sight, then it's very likely not to be that. With time and with experience, you'll definitely notice certain branching patterns. White pines, for example, tend to produce their limbs at specific heights, kind of in layers. So you'll have the trunk going up, and then there'll be a point where it's almost like whorled branches all coming out at the same height, and then there'll be another section of trunk that is completely open. There's no branches, and then you'll get to a point where another large group of branches furls out. So there's kind of patterns like that that you can see compared to most deciduous trees that usually have a very clean trunk form, a single trunk that then opens up umbrellas into some type of canopy. And again, with experience, you look at it more, and especially standing back, looking at the overall shape of trees, you can start to get, we'll call it a sense or a gestalt for IDing them that way. If Yeah, odds are, if you're looking at something that is really far gone, but you're finding good mushrooms on it, then at that point I would probably use the mushroom if I needed help IDing the tree. You know, if I might say, like, I can't tell what this tree is, but I know this is chicken of the woods, and I just know chicken of the woods tends to grow on these species, and based off of the other living trees I'm seeing around me, it's probably a safe assumption to say it's one of those. Usually I don't, it's usually not an issue of, like, you know, oh, this, for example, with chicken of the woods, it's not as if there is a look-alike, a toxic look-alike of chicken of the woods that only grows on conifer trees. And so then you're in a situation of, like, ooh, I don't know what this mushroom is. It could be poisonous. If only I could ID the tree that it's on, that it's growing off of, then I would be sure. You're not gonna run into that situation all that much. I'm gonna turn a light on because it's getting dark here. Yeah. All right, here's another picture of chicken of the woods. Again, we can see these overlapping gills that come out, or I'm sorry, these overlapping shelves that come out. They can really almost grow into each other, as you see. They're not flat. They're not very pristine looking. They have all kinds of ripples and edges. Lots of times, if you see, if the area that the mushroom is growing is impeded by anything, let's say like another branch or trunk that's right up against them, or even some grass, some tall grass growing up around the base of the tree, you'll usually see that a mushroom will grow around it or even through it sometimes. Sometimes that can really, like, distort the shape where you're like, whoa, this looks weirder than this species normally does. And it's because you see, like, oh, well, there's all this grass that it's rippled around as it grew and basically consumed it. But anyway, with chicken of the woods, it definitely has this, like, compact, brainy kind of look to it a lot of times. And as with all mushrooms, when you find them and they're younger and fresher, they tend to be smaller, they tend to be more compact. And then with age, they'll really spread out. For classic mushrooms with the stem and the cap, it'll start as like it's a much more tight structure, and then as it ages, the shape of the cap can really change as it opens up and unfurls. With these, like the hen of the woods or the chicken of the woods, these shelf-like fungi that tend to grow off of dying wood, um, each each one of those separate caps as they overlap, they look. This is a pretty fresh-looking one. They're very compact, but as they age, they'll really spread out and kind of like get a lot more floppy and overlapping of each other.
Another question. Do mushrooms need sun to fruit? It seems like I find them in areas of partial sun as opposed to no sun.
I assume that in general, they definitely need some kind of light indication, or that it certainly helps, but it is not essential. There are some. The best research I've seen on this is more specific to more cultivated culinary species, and in that realm, there are definitely some that respond well to light when it is time to fruit. So there are some that, like, even if you start them off in a darker place, when it's time to fruit them, it's better to bring them out and expose them to a little more light, and it kind of expedites the chemical processing that tells the fungus, like, oh, it's time, make a bunch of mushrooms. But there are also species that don't require it at all. The little button mushrooms that you can get from the store are probably the most common example of. Actually, right, just a couple hours north of us here in Pennsylvania is where, uh, as I understand it, this day, the vast majority of mushroom production for the country occurs. There are tons of businesses up there just growing little button mushrooms, and most of that is done in dark tunnels, like high tunnels and barns. And basically, you can grow them out of manure and other material, and as long as you keep them moist and you keep them at the right temperature, they don't need any light at all. And so you can go, and sometimes you can tour these large barns and tunnels, and unless they turn the lights on so you can walk around, it's pitch black in there, and the mushrooms don't have any problem growing. I do agree that lots of times I will see mushrooms in the forest in kind of like speckled light conditions, um, just beams of light coming in through the treetops. I don't know how much that is, the light is essential to them fruiting well, more so as just like the types of environments we tend to see them in are forests that have intermittent light coming in. There are definitely certain species that really only occur in like conifer forests of pines or hemlocks, which can grow much tighter, create much more dense shade. And those species don't seem to have a problem fruiting at all. So there are probably some species where it helps, at least helps trigger the fruiting process, but I don't know that it's essential for any species of mushroom.
If you leave some mushrooms behind, how quickly will it grow back? I've heard a week, and why you should leave some.
Yeah, good question. So it is definitely a good general foraging rule to always leave some. That is just out of respect for the organism and out of the desire to be able to harvest more of it in the future. If you harvest 100% of it, then you have a 100% guarantee that you're not going to find it again the next time you go looking for it. So don't take all of it. It's producing the mushroom to release spores, to release the new generation that will hopefully grow more. Um, so you definitely want to leave a certain amount. People have different strategies and rules that they follow for ethical foraging in this sense. More often than not, I try to follow the rule of don't take any more than 30 to 40%. Definitely don't ever take more than half. But that is a personal choice that you make, and to your discretion. Sometimes if you find a patch and like there's a massive amount of this, there's hundreds of edible mushrooms here, then you can probably come home with a big stockpile. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're not as concerned with being really picky about leaving a certain amount because there's tons of it around anyway. But you always want to leave enough to make sure that the organism will persist in the environment. Again, for the good of the environment and for the good of you as a forager in the future. Most of these mushrooms that we talk about are perennial in the sense that as long as they continue to have a source of food, which for most of these is wood of some kind usually. So if they're growing off of a dead tree that they're rotting and breaking down and consuming, as long as that tree is there, they're probably still going to be there. You know, a good example being the chicken of the woods that I described. We've had it's a very large log, very large trunk of a tree, big enough that it will take, you know, at least 5 to 10 more years for it to be totally breaking down. And in that time, we're seeing a lot of activity year after year from chicken of the woods coming up. So they'll always leave some. It is a personal decision for you to decide how much you can or should take. You know, there are other good general rules to follow. Certainly never take more than you need. Don't take more than you're going to consume. You don't want it to be wasted. I kind of rambled there for a sec. Did I answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that was perfect. Yeah, if you leave some behind, how quickly will it grow back?
Oh, yes. How quickly will they grow back? That definitely depends on the conditions again. If it is wet enough and there are enough nutrients, then, and depending on the species, lots of times you can, just by taking the fruit, get it to grow back, get a second flush. It's good as a forager to have an awareness of the environment that you're foraging in, and one aspect of that, especially for hunting mushrooms, is the weather. Of, you know, like your foraging is going to be most successful in wet conditions, especially, as I said, right after a rain when there's a lot of water for those fungi to use to grow these mushrooms. If you're looking, trying to decide like, maybe if I take a lot of this, it'll fruit again. Well, what's the weather look like over the next couple of weeks? Are you going to get a lot of rain? Maybe it's more likely that you're going to see more fruit coming in this same spot, and you can come back and frequent it. If you look at that forecast and there's little to no rain and it's going to be pretty dry for a while after this, much more likely that that fungus is going to decide like it's not worth it to fruit again. Better that I survive and try again next year or later in the year. So it depends, but the best rule for making those decisions of how much and if and when it's going to grow back is just going to be direct awareness of that specific environment that you're in. You know, as with a lot of things, I could probably answer every question with it depends. You know, even talking about all of us just living here on the East Coast, even just talking about people living in Maryland, we can have very different microclimates and unique environments with different species growing, and it can have very drastic effects on how different organisms do in different areas. You know, so whether it's because of the tree species that are present or because of the weather conditions that we happen to have. You know, I could have a very different harvest this year than somebody, you know, just 25 or less miles away from me, depending on the situation. This picture that I have here, this is the underside of the chicken of the woods. A very good distinguishing feature is that this underside is yellow. It has this very vibrant yellow color to it. As it ages, this color could fade a little bit, but this is a very good ID tool to have. There is a very similar species to chicken of the woods. Chicken of the woods is Laetoporus sulphureus. Sulphureus meaning sulfur colored. There's another one, Laetoporus cincinnatus. It looks very similar to chicken of the woods. I don't have any pictures of it, I'm sorry, but fortunately it is also edible. It tends to grow at the bases of hardwood trees, or you might even see it seemingly growing out of the ground a couple feet away from the tree. But because it is also a wood rot fungus, if you see it growing out of the ground a little bit away from the trunk of a tree, it's most likely growing out of a root, or growing out of some wood that's been buried for one reason or another. It tends to be a little paler in color. The underside is not bright yellow like this. It's more like whitish pinkish in color. So that can be a good ID tool of, you might be finding the cincinnatus instead of the sulphureus, but they're both edible. let's move on. Oh no. So here's a picture of an old chicken of the woods, and this is an example. You can see the individual caps themselves really grow in size and kind of like start getting floppier, hanging over each other, and all the color just comes out of it. This is far gone enough that I would not bother harvesting this. And then this is a common thing that you'll see with a lot of them. As they age, usually you can tell if they're past their prime either just by feeling them and like, ooh, that's more mushy than I want, or like that's a lot tougher than I want. You know, it gets really leathery or corky and like that wouldn't be palatable to eat. And it'll usually in that situation really lose its color, like you see here. All right, next, this is the bay bolete mushroom. Himlara badia is the Latin name, the scientific name. This one is actually more specifically found in conifer woods. So you will find it around evergreen trees, particularly eastern hemlock. In the areas I frequent here in Maryland, if I am finding a conifer forest or a large patch of conifer trees where I might be looking for specific fungi, the canopy is normally predominantly white pine and eastern hemlock. And hemlock is a really good one for finding a lot of different mushrooms, including the bay bolete. Boletes are also polypores, meaning that if we look at the underside of them, we're not going to see gills. We're going to see this patchwork of pores, of holes coming out of it. From this picture, we can see the stalk of these, which has some toughness to it, has some corkiness to it, has a very distinct reddish brown color to it. If you look even closer, you tend to see it forming in lines. It's kind of like streaks of color running up and down the stalk. This immediately gives way when you get to that underside, kind of like the chicken of the woods. The underside of the bay bolete is a very distinct yellow coloration. So this orange and reddish streaks give way to the yellow coloration of the pore surface, and then the upper side of the cap has a very clean, smooth texture to it, and it is always some nice shade of red. It can be very dull, but especially when it's wet right after rain or with a lot of mist and humidity, it can have a kind of like a greasy, not greasy, a wet sheen to it that makes it look like it's sticky, but it also makes that red color much, much more vibrant. I haven't talked with the others recently. They're a little more easier to ID by the eye, but lots of times when you get into the more classic mushrooms, the stem and cap, there can be a lot of them. The ID can get a little more tricky, and a lot of times a really good way to ID them is by taking a spore print. For those who are not familiar, basically a spore print is just taking the mushroom and allowing it to, as it naturally will, just drop a bunch of spores. And you collect them by taking that mushroom out of the wild and putting it on a surface that you want those spores to collect on, whether that's a piece of paper or a sheet of glass, something flat, something with a uniform color that is distinctly different than the color that the spores will be, so that they really stand out. Spores are a really good identifying feature because for different species, there are so many different colors of spores that we can find. The bay bolete mushrooms, for example, these spores have it's a darker color in my experience. I can't remember it now. If I'm remembering correctly, they tend to be a darker brown. Don't quote me on that. Somebody double check, make sure that I'm saying my stuff right. But you will find on whether it's Mushroom Expert like I described or some other site, it is very easy to find information on the spore color because it is a very popular ID tool. The most distinguishing thing about the bay bolete that I find is that underside, that spore surface, this yellow underside. It will bruise. A lot of different, or sometimes with mushrooms, another good ID tool is that they'll bruise, and that means whether it's just touching it and rubbing it with your hand or cutting it with a knife when you go to harvest it, when you break some of those cells and you expose them to oxygen, it causes a chemical reaction that will change the color of the area that you damage. And we call this bruising. With the bay bolete, that underside, that spore underside of the cap, it's that very noticeable yellow, but when you rub it, or if you cut it, it'll bruise to a like bluish gray color. Stands out very much. I think I have an example picture of that in here. So here's another example. These bay boletes, they definitely do not cluster as much as something like the hen or the chicken of the woods that we saw. You can definitely see them growing in bunches. They're never like solitary mushrooms, but you'll probably only see a couple growing right in the same spot. You might see a couple more scattered around. And so it's easy to take distinguishing pictures of a single one like this. Here's a picture I put in to emphasize again the pores underneath. You can kind of see the holes are getting a little larger as it stretches to the edge here, but it's individual circular pores of some kind, as opposed again to gills or ridges that we might see on other types of mushrooms. But yes, here's an example of the bruising. And that is just from a thumbprint. That's just from somebody touching it, rubbing it, pinching it a little bit. And it bruises very quickly. The color change is less than a minute before it starts to change. So it can be very obvious. Bay boletes are a choice edible. Their flavor, in my experience, tends to be a little more mild than a lot of other mushrooms. So especially for somebody that's trying, not particularly keen on them, this can be a good one to start with. It's not super potent in that earthiness. There's been some good research that shows that bay bolete mushrooms have really good anti-inflammatory properties to them. So that's a potential use for medicine that somebody could find. There has also been some research that shows that bay boletes in particular are really good at drawing metals out of the ground. And so this can be an issue of concern when you're finding and collecting them. Because particularly they can be good at pulling dangerous metals out of the ground, like arsenic and lead and mercury. So we need to really be conscious of the potential for that when we're harvesting. Again, another really good reason to be very aware of the environment in which you're harvesting if you do find these. Are you far out in the woods in public or a protected area? Are you kind of on the edge of the woods? And if so, is there the potential for a lot of runoff or pollution coming into this area from businesses or whatever is around you? Is there a obvious water runoff source nearby that could potentially be funneling metals and other toxins into the area? That's always a concern for anything, any mushrooms that you're hunting for. Like, if you find really choice mushrooms and they're growing just downstream from a water treatment plant, maybe be a little more hesitant of what those mushrooms are potentially collecting. But bay boletes in particular are known to collect a lot of different metals in their flesh. So just be aware of that. Again, if I was truly out in the middle of the woods somewhere, far enough away from a potential source of contamination, I probably would not be all that worried, but something to keep in mind. Next, we have puffballs. Everybody can recognize a puffball because that's simply what they are. They appear as giant, pure white balls sitting out in the forest. Puffballs are coming out of the ground. So unlike all the others that we've talked about so far, that more specifically are breaking down and eating wood, lignin material, puffballs are going for more generally just all the detritus that is on the ground. So not just wood and sticks, but leaves, other dead organic matter from plants and things that have just fallen to the ground and are forming the leaf litter on the ground. You can find them in forests, definitely open woods. I have also seen them growing in much more open areas, not like out in the middle of a cow field, but maybe. Whereas the ones that are a lot more dependent specifically on like a dead hardwood that they can survive off of, you're going to see them in the woods where large hardwoods are dying. Puffballs, I see them much more all over the place. They can be deep in the woods. They can be right at the edge of the woods. I've seen them growing in drainage ditches on the side of the road. So you can find them lots of places. They usually get quite big. I mean, I'm going to say on average, you'll find them being the size of a soccer ball. They can be smaller than that, but usually if they're smaller than that, just let them grow for another day or two and they will get massive. Here's a smaller one. I put this in here specifically so you can see the damage on it. Usually a fresh, clean puffball has a very pure white, smooth, clean finish to it. This one has been damaged by slugs. You'll find that there's a lot of different things that love to eat mushrooms like we do. A lot of different beetles is normally what you'll find chewing up your mushrooms, but slugs love them too. And lots of times you'll see these, it looks like big chunks have been taken out, or there's like a line as if like somebody gouged out a big streak of it, and that lots of times is from slugs. Fortunately, with slugs, they'll eat that chunk, as you can see, and they move on. Normally, if you find slug damage, as long as it's not truly bad and like the mushroom is falling apart, that's good enough. I would just wash that off when I take it home, as I would do in any situation, and that's still edible, and that should be fine. Puffballs are really desirable for their flavor. They've got a solid flavor to them. Again, they are also one that, like, you soak them in just about anything and they'll take on the flavor of that. So they can work really good as a substitute in anything. One of the biggest perks of finding giant puffballs, the scientific name of the giant puffball is Calvadia gigantea. Gigantea. Giant. But anyway, one of the most choice reasons that people like to collect puffballs is because it is unlike a mushroom where it's, the stem, usually with a lot of species, the stem is kind of a little harder or corkier. You might rip off the stem and choose not to cook it and just have the cap. With these, the whole thing is edible. It's just a giant spherical ball of delicious tissue. When you cut into it, yeah, there we go. When you cut into it, you can see it is a solid mash of flesh. And this is what you are looking for, all pure white on the inside. When you cut these, you'll see while the exterior is still very clean, this one has a little bit of spotting here and there, but it's a very smooth, very clean surface. There is actually a distinct layer that is the surface, and then the flesh within it. So lots of times you'll go to catch these, and there'll be a little bit of pushback. You kind of have to really push the knife into it, and you'll get that pop as you cut through that exterior layer, and then the inner tissue is softer than that, and it cuts really well. So because of the size of these and because of the consistency of the flesh, you can cut them, you can slice them, you can dice them, you can crumble it up and cook it like scrambled eggs. You can cut it into cubes and cook it up like you would tofu or any other kind of meat. You can cut it into very big slabs and cook them on the grill like a steak or like a big portobello or something. So they're really great when you can find them. Lots of times, if you're lucky enough, you find them at the right time where they're sizing up, but you could let it get a little bigger and you can have a massive amount. If you can get a big enough puffball, they also store really well. So like you can cut it up and process it, keep it in the fridge, you can freeze bits of it and continue to eat it over a long period of time, just because you can get so much out of a single one. What else do I want to say about these? You want to make sure that the flesh on the inside here is, again, consistent and pure white. This is basically an immature puffball. The way that these mushrooms produce their spores is this entire interior over time will soften up and then change and be converted as more and more spores are created. As with a lot of different mushrooms, those spores are a very unique color. And so in this next picture, we can see here is a puffball that is too far gone. You cut into it and you see that coloration. It can be different shades of yellow or brown as it gets even older, but that is telling you don't eat it, too far gone. You can get sick from eating the spores. So you're better off just leaving this be. And if they're old enough, and if you wait long enough, as I'm sure a lot of us have had fun doing with smaller species of puffball in the past, when they're ready to release their spores, they open up that little crack right at the top, and you can squish them, and a big plume of spores come out. And it can be fun to look at. Careful, don't inhale too many of them. But that is a sure sign of, that is the eventual stage that this mushroom is getting to. So this one in particular, you can't wait until it's dropping spores. By that point, it's too far gone. You want it, again, you want this nice, clean interior, which is, again, technically the immature point for the puffball. Seems crazy that this can be immature when, again, you can find balls that are bigger than your head. If you're out in the field, you don't necessarily have to cut it all the way in half like this. You might just be able to cut out a little section on the side and make sure yeah, that all looks nice and clean inside. And then it's worth, okay, we can take the whole thing home and process it more back at home.
We have a question.
Yeah.
Are these all species that are typically grown in the East?
Yes.
And considering if it rains tonight and into tomorrow, given the temperature, will it be a good time to hunt for them?
This is prime time. There are a lot of species of fungi that can handle all kinds of conditions. There's plenty of unique edible choice mushrooms that you look for specifically in the summer. But spring and fall seem to be really ideal times for finding a lot of different species. And I think a big part of that just has to do with it tends to be wetter, but also the temperatures tend to be a little more mild one way or the other. So yeah, this is a choice time to look for all these species. Because again, all of these are not just good local species to find that you can find all throughout the East Coast area, but they're good species to find now. These are things that we're seeing August through October for the most part is the prime window of looking for all these. So absolutely, if we get a good amount of rain, and again, you need a solid rainstorm to really saturate the environment to produce or to have enough water for these fungi to produce their fruiting structure. If we get a little rainstorm, one afternoon or evening, it only lasts for an hour or two. You're probably not going to find all that much happening in the way of new mushrooms coming up. But if we get a really solid rainstorm, everything's wet, you wake up the next morning, everything is still wet, yeah, perfect time to go out looking for all these things. And again, it happens fast. It's a small window where these things grow fast. If they don't grow overnight, it's usually only a day or two for them to really get going. And then they only last so long. A lot of them usually, there's like a week that is the ideal window to find them. So yeah, especially if we get a solid amount of rain in the next couple days, go out, check it out. You're gonna find something good, no doubt. Ooh, okay.
Question: do puffballs have any spines on them, or am I thinking
of something? The giant puffball does not. It is a very nice, clean surface, as you can see here. There are other species that will have, I don't know, you might call them hairs, you might call them just frill, but kind of little tufts of flesh that stick out. Lots of times they can be a different color. They can have like a browner texture or a browner color to them. Some of the other puffballs that are out there are edible. Some of them are not at all edible. But the giant puffball is the easiest to spot simply because of the size that it will get. All of the other local puffball species that I know of are, they're more like the size of marbles, or like small tomatoes at best. None of them even get close to the size that giant puffballs can get. Again, on average, when I find them, they're like the size of a sports ball, a soccer ball, or a volleyball or something, if not larger than that. So they really stand out for sure. All right. I'm going to try and go a little bit faster here, but again, please keep the questions coming if you got them. So I've got 3 in this next group. These are the Hericium genus of fungi. What you see here is the most popular kind. This is the lion's mane fungi, Hericium erinaceus. And when you see it, it is very unique. There's nothing else within the world of mushrooms that looks like it in our area. It produces this large mass of these hairs or teeth, they're more commonly described as, kind of cascading over each other in a single mound. And with lion's mane specifically, you see it in a single mound like this. Sometimes it's a very smooth, perfect looking surface like this one. Sometimes like this, you'll kind of see, okay, it looks almost like there's a couple little clumps growing together, but it still takes on overall a nice single clump mound kind of shape that you could cut the whole thing off at once and harvest it. These teeth will continue to elongate as it gets older, but only to a certain extent. And on the lion's mane, you tend to see a variety of lengths, as you can see on this picture. Some of these teeth will dangle lower than the others, especially on the edges. The freshest ones, they tend to be much shorter, and it gives you this cascading effect where you can see more teeth behind those teeth, et cetera, going all the way back. They look very pretty and frilly, but that they are not limp or soft to the extent that like they'll shake back and forth. They're not going to blow in the wind. This is a solid spongy structure like you would expect from most mushrooms that you would encounter. They are delicious, edible. They are also a really choice medicinal mushroom. There's some really cool research that's in the past decade come out looking into the different chemical constituents found within the lion's mane fungi that help with your brain health, specifically by helping to minimize the degradation and even potentially the regeneration of the myelin sheath, which is a special type of tissue that surrounds and coats your nerve cells, and it helps to insulate and expedite the nerve cell's ability to send an electrical signal down its axon. The degradation of this sheath means that your nerves have a harder time effectively signaling these electrical impulses to each other, which can lead to all kinds of mental issues, particularly as we get older and degrade. There's a lot of different ailments related to the loss of memory that deal with the degradation of this tissue in your brain. So there's some really cool new research showing that lion's mane can, the consistent consumption of it can potentially be a very effective medicine in helping keeping that tissue in your brain in there and keeping you sharper longer. There are two other species that we can potentially find that are in the same genus, the Hericium genus in our area. The lion's mane is the most common, but we can also find this. This is known as the bear's head tooth, Hericium americanum. Very similar, as you can see. One difference here is that you see all of these nice long teeth coming out again like the lion's mane, but where we see the variety in the length of the teeth on the lion's mane, on the bear's head tooth, they all tend to be right around the same length going down. You also see that there's a little more branching going on, and as these grow out even more, they can really take on much more of a almost like a coral-like look to them. Whereas the lion's mane kind of tends to stay the one globular mass, these can really billow out in different ways. Here's another example as it starts to kind of create these arm-like extensions that will grow out and form their own masses. The other one is known as the comb tooth mushroom. This is Hericium coralloides. Coralloides meaning coral-like, and you really get that. This is the most extreme example in the genus of, it has the teeth just like the other two species, but it really branches out. So you get this really glorious, almost like frost or coral-like appearance to it. Again, all three of these species are edible, but the most common that you're going to find is the lion's mane. The most consistent thing between all these is their very unique feature of they don't have a cap with an underside where the spores are produced that's different from the top of the cap. They're just these billowing cascades of these teeth or these tendrils, whichever species that you're going to find. They're all edible. So at least if you can get it down to a confirmation of it's definitely one of the Hericium species, then you're good to go edibility wise. Moving on, we're looking at honey mushrooms.
Sorry, we got some questions about lion's mane.
Yep.
What are the months for lion's mane, and where is a good place to find them?
Again, this time of year is the best. Usually, I've seen them in August before, but definitely getting into September. This is the best time to see them. In my personal experience, I have seen them on living hardwoods. I don't know if these are specifically, if they're parasitic, that they're only eating living tissue, or if they're saprophytic, which means if there's part of the tree that has died, they're breaking down that dead material. Or it could be a species that can do both, can alternate between one and the other. I'm not sure with the Hericiums, but in my experience, I've only ever found them on standing trees, living and dead, mostly living. That may just be anecdotal. I have found them on hardwoods like oaks. I even found one on a maple, on a red maple once, which I don't hear a lot of other people talking about. That was pretty unique. I wouldn't necessarily look on maples like that. Your best bet again is hardwood species. We're talking about oaks, maybe even hickories, depending on the forest system that you're in. They are growing. They are definitely growing directly out of wood. You're never going to see these growing straight out of the ground. They're hanging off of a tree, or they're hanging off of a log somewhere. But now is definitely the right time to check them out. These, when they're first starting out, they can be very small, a little puff of tendrils, and then as they age, they can get significantly larger. The largest I've ever found is probably at least a couple inches across. I'd use both hands to hold it. Oh yeah. Moving on.
We do have one more question. Taylor, which mushrooms glow in the dark and found in Maryland? What seasons and how does one make it glow? Touch it, or full moon, or shine a flashlight? I've heard some species are found few in local sanctuaries, but never got to see one yet.
Yeah, there are definitely a handful of species that are bioluminescent. The only one that I'm really familiar with, I will actually get to pretty soon. So I'll hold off on that for now. But that can absolutely be a very good ID feature, especially if you have the right lighting conditions. Normally, you don't have to instigate it to glow by, bruising it or anything like that. It's normally like the same as most glow in the dark things that you have. It's just that it'll look normal in the light, and then once it gets darker, and especially if you're walking through the woods, like once your eyes have adjusted to the darkness, so it's not glowing so brightly that like you can be walking around with a flashlight and see it growing or see it glowing even through that flashlight. Normally, if you want to see the bioluminescence of a mushroom, you have to turn off your light, let your eyes adjust to that darkness, and then there's going to be that faint glow that really sticks out. And so again, the species we have around here that I'm most familiar with as a bioluminescent, I'll get to in a little bit. So I'll move on real quick. So what we're looking at now is a honey mushroom. There's two main species of honey mushroom that I want to talk about. The genus that they're in is Armillaria. There are at least a dozen species of honey mushroom that are edible. There's a lot of them. Some of them are a lot harder to ID than others. I'm talking about the two most common, the two most familiar ones around here. What we're looking at now is Armillaria millia. This is one I have seen this growing on hardwoods and conifers. So again, if you're in an area that's predominated by conifers like pines or hemlock trees, this might be a good one to look for. I tend to see them growing around the bases of these trees. Definitely growing out of the wood itself, not necessarily growing out of the ground. Or again, if it is growing out of the ground, I'm usually expecting it's either coming out of a root or some buried detritus of wood. So I'm looking for it again in association around these trees. It has this very nice honey color. This is the name or this is where the name for honey mushrooms come from. They don't really taste like honey. That would be really cool. They have a very distinct, very classic, strong mushroom flavor to them. So yeah, when we think of the honey mushroom, the namesake is really coming from this nice creamy honey color that we see on the caps here. This will get browner, especially at the center with age. We can see some shagginess here, some little frills of flesh that kind of come off his hair. Some closer up pictures I'll see in a bit have that. What I really want to point out with this is this is a young cluster. We can see that as they are coming up, they have what's known as a veil, a partial veil. And what that means is we can see, like on these over here, when they come up, the stem is actually directly connected to the cap and it's sealed off. And only once the mushroom grows enough and begins to mature will that cap begin to open up. And in the process of opening up, it will break that seal and peel away, and we'll start to see this little remnant, this ring of flesh that persists just underneath the cap. And we call that ring the veil. So that is a really good distinguishing feature. Here's an example of some honey mushrooms. This is a good example of, you know, when they're very young, when they're very small, the caps are always very tight. The color is a lot more strong and distinct. As they age, those caps are going to open up, and usually those colors are going to darken or dull over time. So that's what we see here. Caps that have really opened up. They're much larger in their appearance. Their color is a little less radiant or impressive, but still good honey mushrooms. And one really good way that we can tell that is they still have this massive ring left over from that veil that was broken. These mushrooms do have the classic gill. The gills underneath have a very nice white color to them. They tend to grow in clusters like this, which again, when they're small, they look very packed together. As they get bigger, some of these will unfurl and rot a lot quicker than others, but then you'll have a lot of fewer but larger mushrooms with much wider frilly caps that have spread out all over the place. I have seen these, as this picture depicts. They can be in much more open places than the woods, like in the middle of a lawn. But again, they are decomposers. They are parasites of trees. So they're going to be growing in association with trees. So again, even if it looks like it's coming out of the ground, it's probably feeding off of the roots of a tree, and it's not going to be too far from a tree, you know, at least within a couple feet of the base of a tree, if not right at the base of that tree. Again, the partial veil is the best thing to look for on this honey mushroom, the Malea. There is another species of honey mushroom, Armillaria tabescens, I believe is how it's pronounced, Tabescens. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the Malea still. That very prominent, you can see that shagginess, a little bit of that frill, but most importantly, here's the veil just as it's breaking, and then once the cap really unfurls, that veil persists. And you can see the actual gills, the classic gills of this mushroom underneath. There is another variety, here we go. This is another honey mushroom, Armillaria tabescens again. This is the ringless honey mushroom. It has a lot of the same distinguishing features in color and form. It's got a bit of the shagginess as the other honey mushroom, but a very, very distinguishing feature, it never has that veil. The nice smooth stem all the way down. From the top, these tend to have a little more like compact buttony kind of shape to them almost. They won't get nearly as wide as the other honey mushroom, the Malea. So even after they've unfurled, they still have this tighter, clustered look to them. Very pleasing. You know, looks like you could just pop them in your mouth easily for fun. Their color might be a little more different than the other honey mushroom, maybe a little more tannish brown, but still pretty distinguishing, pops out pretty easily. So now we're going to get into two lookalikes. There's a lot of honey mushrooms. Some of them are harder to ID than others, like I said, but we also want to be really good about our ID because there are some toxic lookalikes. One of them is this one. The common name is the deadly Galerina, the the scientific name is Galerina marginata, or depending on what reference guide you're using, it could be Galerina autumnalis, as in it shows up in the autumn. Both of those names apply to the same species of deadly Galerina. Although it can be found in autumn, I've seen this spring through fall. So you can find it just about any time all over the place. They are not parasites, as in they're not just consuming living tissue from living trees. They are strictly decomposers. You're going to find them on dead logs more often than not. I think I've only ever found them on fallen over dead logs. And they tend to be a lot more scattered out than these clusters that we see with the honey mushrooms. So again, they tend to be scattered. They do have a similar color cap as the honey mushrooms. That tends to be what can be confusing to people. I think they're a little more brown, darker brown usually. And the gills underneath, it has gills like the honey mushrooms, but they tend to be a darker, like a rusty brown kind of color compared to the much lighter yellows and creams of these. Here's very white looking. In a different photo, that might be a little more creamier in color, but still usually very distinct than this darker color underneath. This rusty brown color. And that coloration on these gills comes from the fact that the spore print on these, if you were to take a spore print, you would find that the spores are a rusty brown color to them. So if you're, maybe they're honey mushrooms, but you really want to make sure, take a spore print. If they're white and very light creamy in color, much more likely to be a honey mushroom. If they're a darker rusty brown kind of color, much more likely to be the deadly Galerina. They will also have this remnant of a ring persisting, like one of the honey mushrooms. However, it tends to be not as impressive. If we look back, you know, this ring it's a frill. It's very impressive. It persists for a very long time, and it stays kind of strong and fleshy. Whereas on the deadly Galerina, the ring will persist. It's much smaller, much less conspicuous, usually darker in color, and it kind of like will degrade to the point where it's just like, it almost looks like just a stain on the stalk itself. It's not really a strong fleshy bit that grows out. It'll just kind of fall flat and stick to the stalk as we see here. You can also see that the stems tend to have a darker coloration than on the honey mushrooms. So that's the deadly Galerina, can be commonly mistaken for honey mushrooms. So that's a good, important distinction to make. If you're finding what you think are honey mushrooms, a really good opportunity to take the time. Don't just try them. You know, don't just be like, well, here's one way to find out if they're toxic or not. Eat a little bit of them. No, take your time. Really look at ID books. Share pictures with other people. Look at different reference guides. Try and constantly confirm this. This is more of the deadly Galerina. You can also see as they age, they can kind of get this weird white splotchiness on the cap. You don't really see that happening with the honey mushrooms in my experience. And again, this darker underside of the gills is a really good distinguishing feature. This is the
two quick questions.
Yeah.
What are the markings on the top cap of a mature honey mushroom called?
The markings. You're talking about like this frill?
Yeah. I think yes.
That depending on the guide, I've seen it just described as like specks or frills or hairs sometimes. This is a good example of, there can be a lot of, you know, as with any organism, there can be a lot of variety within a single species. So sometimes I've seen honey mushrooms like this that really prominently have that frill, have that texture to them. And then there can be others, it's the same species, just a different individual, kind of like these, that look much cleaner. They don't have that texture to them as much. But yeah, I don't know of an official word for that feature. It might be different depending on what guide you're using.
Have you heard of any honey mushrooms growing under grapevines?
Ooh, I haven't. Although grapevines are perennials, they produce lignin, and that's hardwood. It's not exactly the same as the wood tissue of a hardwood tree, but it's possible. I have never heard of that, but I'm interested now. I'm going to have to look into that. If it was the same as with the trees, I would expect it to be on more mature grapevines. Again, I don't know, so I won't say it's impossible, but I've only ever heard of honey mushrooms in association with hardwoods. There's a lot of research that goes into that because they are parasites of these hardwood trees. They pose a really serious issue for people growing trees for all kinds of different reasons, especially within the lumber industry. They'll cause a very particular fungal disease that rots out the roots of the trees and kills them. So there's a lot out there about how honey mushrooms will grow in association with a lot of different tree species, and if left unchecked, can wipe them out. But no, I've never heard of them growing out of grapevines. Here's one other look-alike that I want to talk about. This is more commonly mistaken for chanterelles, which I won't get into because chanterelles we tend to look for more in summer than coming into fall and autumn here. So I won't focus on them too much, but these can be mistaken for honey mushrooms of different kinds. These are decomposers, so they're breaking down dead wood. We're not going to see them on living trees. We're going to see them again on logs, around the bases of dead trees or stumps. If we see them growing away from a tree, it's likely that there is some type of wood or root or otherwise that is under the ground, and that's actually what they're growing out of. They're not just growing out of the soil. The spore color tends to be a pale cream kind of color, usually darker than the much closer to white of the honey mushroom spore prints that I've seen. But even before getting to a spore print, usually I think the best ID for these is their color. It kind of looks like that same honey creamy color, but in my experience, it tends to be a more vibrant orange. And you'll notice it's a pretty consistent color of orange from the cap all the way down to the stem. Here's an example of a colony. They've gotten bigger, so the individual caps themselves have really fanned out and gotten larger. That doesn't mean it's a different species. That just means that this particular cluster is older than some of these, say. So yeah, that bright orange color, even the gills has that orange look to it. And here, this is a bioluminescent. This is the most familiar bioluminescent fungus that I know in our area. Again, this is the jack-o'-lantern, the Latin name Ophalatus can I say it? Olivascens, Olivascens. Pronounce that how you will, but the jack-o'-lantern. So yeah, here's an example of a bioluminescent. Again, like this doesn't become bioluminescent when you bruise it or anything. It's just you notice it glowing in the dark. And as this picture displays, with this species in particular, it is only the gills that are bioluminescent. So if you're only seeing this from the top, the caps themselves aren't going to grow or aren't going to glow. The stems themselves are not going to glow. So, if you happen to be out at night, or if you want to take a sample and try and wait till night to look at it, you might be able to use this as a good distinguishing feature. Like the deadly Galerina, the jack-o'-lantern is a toxic mushroom. And that's why I pointed out here. It can be mistaken for honey mushrooms. It's not a common ID mistake, but it can happen, especially because it's toxic. We want to make sure that we're really aware. So the best thing is this bright orange coloration all over. Another really good obvious feature that we can see in these pictures is, like the honey mushrooms, we have gills on the underside of the cap where the spores are produced. But notice on the honey mushroom, the gills are just under the cap and they grow right up to the base of the stem and they stop there. On the jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, the gills persist and they grow down onto the stem a little bit. So we see this kind of extension right under the cap there. That can also be a really good distinguishing feature to tell them apart. All right. And last but not least, really quick, is the turkey tail. Everybody's seen turkey tail at some point. Trommedes versicolor. Versicolor named for all the vibrant colors that it can produce. This is a decomposer, so you're gonna, again, it's not gonna be on living trees. You're gonna see it breaking down dead wood tissues. You're gonna see it on sticks and logs and stumps. It grows these fan-like or ear-like projections, these shelves that stack on top of each other. These can get to the point where they cover the entire surface of a log or whatever wood that they're growing out of, or they can be much smaller clusters like you see here. They're distinguished for these bands of color that we get, and these can be all kinds of shades of oranges and browns and blacks and even greens and blues sometimes, reddish, purplish kind of variety going on. And most of the pictures I have here are just to show you the variety of color that we can find. Turkey tail is a polypore mushroom. So like a lot of these we've talked about, it doesn't have gills. It has pores on the underside. And so that is a good ID tool to have. Turkey tails in general have a very, the caps themselves are very thin. They almost have a leathery quality to them. That leathery texture is kind of emphasized by these do in fact have very noticeable fluff to them, or I don't know, depending on the guide, it might be fluff, it might be hairs, but you can even see the texture a little bit in this picture here, so that when you feel it, it not only has kind of like the bendable consistency of leather where you can bend it and it won't break, it's kind of malleable, but it also has a softness to the touch that makes it seem like leather to me. But if you look at them closely, they're kind of like little projections, soft hairs, we'll call them. They tend to stay smaller, like each of these individual caps or fans can be like 2 to 3 inches across. You don't tend to see like massive individuals. Instead, it'll be a massive growth of a bunch of these fanning out, overlapping each other. As I said, it's pores on the underside, but compared to a lot of other species, like lots of times the boletes, we talked about the bay bolete, a lot of boletes, they have pores and the pore sizes are large. And it's very noticeable, like, wow, these large pore structures. Turkey tail, the pores are very, very small. So you turn it over and it's nice and white, but it can just look kind of like fluffy or pubescent almost. But when you look really close, you can see that there are still pores. They're just very, very tiny and they pack in a lot. Here's a really good colored one. Turkey tails, because of they're very thin and they have that leathery quality to them, I don't know of many people that really try to cook them up and eat them in meals as a culinary. These are much more known for being a medicinal mushroom that you can find. They're packed with antioxidants. There's a lot of research out there on that. And there's also some good work showing that this is another one that's really good at stimulating immune response in your body. So especially, I mean, it can be good to take consistently to try and maintain the health of your immune system, but it can also be good right at the start of an illness to try and, really wake up your immune system and get it going faster, responding faster to whatever potential illness you're getting. These are really common. They're all over the place. Again, there's a lot of variety in the bands of color and in the amount of color. You can see here's on the other underside here. Again, like if you looked really close, these would all be individual little pores. But from this distance, it's just this nice white field that almost looks soft. There are some lookalikes to turkey tail. There's even a species called false turkey tail. They're pretty similar. As far as I know, false turkey tail is not toxic, but it also does not have at this point, the wealth of research that is out there talking about any particular benefits that it has. But turkey tail is a very popular medicinal. There's a lot out there about it, and so it can be a good one if you find it and collect it to, properly dry it, grind it, chop it down into a powder of some kind, and take it in different forms. Yep. So that's all I had. We went through about a dozen species there. Again, these are all very common this time of year. I kind of went through them quickly. So sorry for the crash course mentality. And again, I will always emphasize I am by no means an expert, and even if I was, I should not be the only one that you listen to. Your best bet in IDing any of these is to go out of your way to vet multiple sources. It'll not only be putting in the work to make you that much better of a forager and an IDer, but in certain situations, it is very crucial to do that work to make sure that you're not going to get sick from consuming these. And even for the species that are edible, even once you have, with complete confidence, confirmed, yes, yes, this is a honey mushroom, or yes, this is a maitake, a hen of the woods, and you can go ahead and eat it. Especially if you haven't had it in the past, you haven't had that much of it, I would recommend starting by taking smaller doses of it. Give it a taste, give it a try. There are many of these mushrooms. It is the case that not everybody's gut can handle it. Some people can have it and they're fine. Some people can have it and get a lot of gastrointestinal upset. Some people, you can get that upset at first, but as you eat it over time, it gets better and you can just enjoy it. So whatever the case is, again, especially if you're new to foraging, you're new to eating wild mushrooms, even after you get that 100% confidence in your ID, start small and see how your body reacts to it and listen and go from there. So yeah, that's all I had prepared. Again, it was kind of a crash course, but I hope this has been helpful. And if people have any more questions, we'll keep taking notes at this point.
Yep, they're already flowing in. We have someone asking, is turkey tail toxic to dogs?
I don't know. Not that I know of. I've never specifically heard anybody putting that warning out there. And it is a popular enough species that if it was, I just imagine I would have heard something at this point. But well worth researching further.
Makes sense. Can you, let's see, how do you distinguish turkey tail from false turkey tail?
False turkey tail, the color bands are a lot less impressive in general. In my experience, it also tends to grow smaller. I'm not as familiar with it in terms of like maybe it produces a different spore print or something. That's well worth looking into. And just about any guide that you're gonna have is gonna give that kind of explanation. I tend to see turkey tail out there, and I'm able to ID it to a confidence level. They're like, yep, that's definitely turkey tail. They can grow in close proximity to each other. They can tend to grow in the same woods, so it's well worth looking into that a bit more. But in general, I know that the actual caps or the shells that it produces tend to be smaller, and yeah, the coloration is not as impressive or not as complex. Just a little more kind of like blandish browns and tans.
Jeff asks, what forests do you go hunt for mushrooms?
I live in the Thurmont area. That's northern Frederick County, in the foothills of the mountains here. So I'll definitely go up into that area, into the Catoctin area a lot. The Foxhaven, out in Jefferson, Maryland, that's western Frederick County where we work, is an excellent location just because we have a lot of acreage of fields, but also of woodlands, both original woodlands that were there when the land was bought, and new woodlands that have been grown from extensive tree plantings over the years. So we do a lot in there. We do a lot of searching, and just, that's a good place to explore. Again, once the pandemic settles down and we're able to have people out again, we will be eager that we can do more regular foraging hikes just to explore and find all the mushrooms that we will there. Your best bet more often than not is parks or publicly managed forests of any kind. Like a lot of foraging, if you're familiar with the community of foragers at all, there will be lots of really good patches that remain a secret, both out of people interested in just making sure that they get some of them every year and they don't want a lot of people knowing about it, but also Most foragers have a very good, a respect for the things that they are foraging, a respect for the ecosystem that they are taking from, and because of that, they want to make sure that it doesn't get over harvested. And so one way that they'll do that is to keep it secret and not share their specific spots. Um, so again, that's a common enough thing. If you just straight up ask people like, where do you hunt for this? They might say like, I'm not going to tell you. They might give you an idea of the trees you'll find it with, but they won't tell you the specific spot. But in general, I would say any woods in your area. Again, we talked about a few tonight that you can find in forests dominated by conifers. But the vast majority of what I find on a regular basis is growing off of deciduous hardwoods of some kind. And so just going out into the woods, again, there's plenty of mushrooms that'll grow out in the field, another open ecosystem, but they're built, a lot of them for the most part are built to decompose wood, and they're really good at it. They're the best kind of organism that can do it, and so we find them in the woods. So any wooded area that you have, and it doesn't have to be some massive expanse of woods. Again, there are a lot of species that you're going to be more likely to find them on more mature trees, trees that have had a lot of time to grow. So maybe in like a freshly planted area where there's a lot of trees, but they're only 10 or 20 years old, you're probably less likely to find a lot of these. Those fungal organisms haven't had the time to show up in response to those trees being there and grow themselves to a point where they have the resources and can afford to reproduce and create these mushrooms. So older trees, older forests are better, but really anywhere that's wooded that you have, even if it's like a small lot behind your house, in the middle of your suburban neighborhood. If there's a small woodland patch somewhere, well worth exploring. Even if you don't find one of these really common edible mushrooms, I can guarantee that you're going to find some kind of fungus growing there. You're going to find some kind of mushrooms in association with any tree, just about. So the forest is your best bet. Wooded areas of any kind is what I'd recommend for all of these that we talked about tonight.
Can turkey tail be ground up into a powder and used as an additive for dishes?
Yeah, absolutely. I've never heard of anybody using it as like a spice. I don't think its flavor is unique and strong enough. I mean, other than maybe just giving you more of that earthy, woodsy kind of flavor. Yeah, so like as like a flavor garnish or a spice, not so much, but definitely if that's the easiest way for you to regularly ingest it and you're trying to get some medicinal effect out of it, that could be a great way to do it. Powder it or crumple it up enough that you could sprinkle it on food, or you could put it in a capsule, or you could put some of that powder in your tea and drink it. Tea is better with some types of mushroom than others, basically because sometimes the important chemicals that you are trying to consume to get the health benefit can be damaged or broken down if they get hot enough. So that's well worth, if you're interested in taking that route, do a little more research yourself, because some of them it works fine. Put it in hot tea water and no problem, you'll still get those benefits. Others, there might be a chance that, well, if your tea is hot enough and you pour that powder in, then all of those important antioxidants or whatever other chemicals that you want are going to break down, and maybe you're not going to get the health benefit that you want. So that's worth looking into more. But yeah, just as a garnish on food, go for it.
Kimberly asks, if I want to hunt for chicken in the woods, how should I time my hunt? How many days after a good rain will there be enough growth to be worth harvesting at a decent volume while still leaving some behind?
If there is enough rain, if there is enough moisture, it can grow in less than a week, a matter of days. Normally, especially, around very specific times of year like now, when I'm interested in going out and finding stuff, as soon as it rains, I am out. If it rained really heavily all night long tonight, first thing tomorrow, I would be going out and looking. I would probably, if I found stuff, it would probably be small. It just started growing. but like it's already going to be growing, potentially enough that I can notice it, and then I can see, oh, here's this chicken of the woods. It's small enough now that I want to let it go, but at least now I know where it is. But most of the time, if it rains really heavily and you go out 24 hours later, stuff's going to have grown have stuff will have grown enough that it'll probably be a little more noticeable, a little easier to spot. But if it is the right time of year that and we get a really nice rain event, be seriously looking within the next couple days, because you're gonna find it. And again, like, this stuff grows fast and it's not around for all that long. You definitely have a tight window when it comes to foraging. And again, in that prime window, there are lots of things that you can forage still when they're a little past their prime, and especially after you cook them up, they can still be good. There are lots of things, especially if you're using them for medicinal purposes, that they can persist, be really past their prime, be really dried out, be really tough in their texture, and that's fine, because you're just going to dry them up and grind them up.
Taylor, are you still there? I think you're frozen. Can everybody hear me? Oh, is Taylor still frozen on your end? I think so. We might have to conclude here. I think he just might have, his internet connection might have been lost. But thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, any more questions that you would like answered, I'll be sure to include Taylor's email address, and you can ask them directly there. But thank you all so much for coming tonight. It's been really great. Love the participation and all the great questions. And I'll be sending you out the recording and a handout that has all of the information that we discussed on it. So hope you have a great evening. Thank you so much.